Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mocher's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is another part of our several-part series looking at the American Civil War. Today's topic looks at total war, and the Union finds their general in Ulysses S. Grant. So let's talk here a little bit about the winding down to the American Civil War. The textbook readings for this particular lecture comes to us from pages 540 to 543. The guiding questions is, what problems was the North or the Union having with its generals? What is meant by the phrase total war? What general does President Lincoln finally find to lead the Union? And how was Sherman's march to the sea an example of total warfare? So let's talk here about some of these problems that the North is having. Remember, when we first started this video lecture, we looked at the sides and strategies, and we looked at on paper, it seemed as if the North had a clear-cut advantage. It had greater resources, a larger population to pull from. It had a strong leader in President Lincoln, but one area that the Union tended to lack in was on military leadership. And as we've looked at a lot of the battles of the Civil War, most of the battles have been fought in the South, and most of the battles have been won by the South. There's been a few notable exceptions like Vicksburg and Gettysburg and Antietam. But the general trend in the Civil War was Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, was kind of whooping up on these Union generals. He was winning very decisively. So we kind of had a leadership problem of the Union Army. And in fact, Lincoln and his Union generals never really ever agreed on strategy and on policy. And in fact, one of the main generals that will be in charge of the Union Army, a general named George B. McClellan, and Lincoln did not actually get along very well. McClellan did not like Lincoln, and Lincoln did not really like McClellan either. And in fact, after one of the battles, President Lincoln will send McClellan a telegram where it says, "Dear Mr. McClellan, if you're not using the Army, I should like to borrow it for a while. Yours respectively, A. Lincoln." Lincoln's concerns about McClellan was he was really slow to act, was not a very decisive leader. McClellan didn't think Lincoln understood warfare and didn't really listen to him either. And by the time that Lincoln and McClellan finally have reached an impasse and Lincoln replaces McClellan, McClellan runs against Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election as a Democrat. And it's thought by a lot in the North that McClellan might potentially win the election because things were not going very well for the Union in 63 until the battles of Gettysburg and the battle at Vicksburg, where the Union armies both won. So a common theme we have in the North is a lot of failed generals. McClellan is one example, but there are several other generals that Lincoln will call on to lead the Union Army that really ended in complete disasters. You had a guy named John Pope. You had another one called Ambrose Burnside. I wonder if you can guess which one he is. If you said this guy here with a pretty cool looking mutton chops, that's where the term sideburns comes from. So there's Ambrose Burnsides. You've got another one called Joseph Hooker, and of course George Meade, who led the winning victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, but let Lee slip back into Virginia after defeating Lee in Pennsylvania. So you have here in the North kind of a problem. Lincoln is having a hard time finding a general who agrees with Lincoln's own vision of how the war should be waged, and can't seem to find a general who he's looking for. But after the victory at Vicksburg, Lincoln thinks he's found somebody who he can maybe hand over the control of the whole Union Army to implement this victory of strategy of winning the Civil War. And that was our friend back from the Battle of Vicksburg, General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant will be the Union general for the last couple of years of the war. Grant's philosophy on warfare, he says, is very simple. You find out where your enemy is, you get at him as soon as you can, you strike him as hard and as often as you can, and you keep moving along. Grant actually had a very interesting reputation. Grant was trained in military warfare from West Point, didn't really extinguish himself very well as a very young commanding officer in the Mexican-American War. Eventually leaves the Army right before the war breaks out. As the war does commence, he's living in Missouri at the time. He does ask for a military commission, does receive one. He succeeds and fails in several small mental battles. Rumors of his alcohol abuse and being kind of a drunk kind of permeates around in the Western theater, but he does prove himself at like the Battle of Shiloh. where he's able to kind of eventually take over command of the Western armies after that battle, and then he leads the victory to Vicksburg. And so even though he kind of started off his career a little bit shaky during the Civil War, he does kind of make a name for himself. And by 1863, after Lincoln's frustrations of these Eastern generals, he decides to pick a general from the West, and he goes with Grant. And Grant decides to go with a strategy called attrition and total war. War of attrition means that you're going to kill the enemy no matter what your cost. Grant sees on paper, like all of us, is that the North should win. They have the clear advantage in terms of resources and soldiers. So Grant's willing to be a lot more aggressive than the earlier generals, where McClellan and some of the other generals did not want to directly attack Lee. Grant has no qualms about it. He is going to go after Lee wherever Lee is and wherever Lee's army is, the Confederate army is. For example, this is like in the Wilderness Campaign. Well, Grant will lose about 18,000 men in 3 days of fighting and about 7,000 men just in 15 minutes of fighting. I mean, this becomes almost like a slaughter as Grant sends wave after wave after wave of Union soldiers to get after Lee. Grant's willing to make those sacrifices because he knows that he can bring in fresh troops from the North, because the North has a draft. Even though it's very unpopular, it does have a draft. It does have a larger population to pull from, and it has African-American soldiers that are willingly and volunteering into the army. So the North has a large soldier pool to pull from. Lee, on the other hand, he's taking heavy casualties in these battles as well, but the South doesn't have the population to kind of sustain these heavy losses. Grant feels this is the way to further weaken the Confederacy, that you're not going to be able to tiptoe around this issue. You're going to have to just take Lee head on and basically just like two boxers standing toe to toe and just beating each other up senselessly. Grant figures that in the long run that the North is going to withstand those kind of heavy blows. The South is not. It's going to end up collapsing if it keeps these kinds of losses. Grant also implements a type of war called total war. Total war means to destroy all aspects of the army, not just the soldiers, but everything that supports those soldiers into battle. So it's not just going after the soldiers in the army, it's going after everything that supports that army. So it's destroying things like railroads, fields, factories, homes, anything that your enemy can use to support them into the battles is fair game under total war. So in a larger sense, Grant sort of takes the gloves off, where other Union generals were a little bit more cautious in terms of how they were dealing with the Confederacy and the Confederate soldiers in the towns of the South. Grant says the war is going to be very ugly, it's going to be very destructive, and we're going to basically destroy everything. So we see here some images here of examples of total war. Any railroads the South does have, the North is going to destroy them. A very common tactic was to pull the ties up, the railroad tracks up, heat the center of them over an open fire, and then wrap them around trees so they can never be used again. Lay waste to towns, plantations, setting them on fire was this idea of total warfare. As Grant moves back to the east to take command of the Union Army, he does have a friend of his, Sherman, who's going to take care of things out in the west for him. And Sherman's Tecumseh Sherman's philosophy of warfare, as stated by this quote, "We cannot change the hearts and minds of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible, make them so sick of war, that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it." And Grant's March to the Sea Sherman's March to the Sea is an example case of Grant's total warfare, what Grant's looking for. In May of 1864, the Union Army was stationed up in Tennessee, near Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was a major railroad station for the Confederacy. As Grant leaves, he gives Sherman the command to take Chattanooga and cut a swath of destruction through the state of Georgia, which exactly is what Sherman does. So from May of 1864 until the fall of 1864, Sherman marches through to Atlanta, Georgia, which is in the center of the state, and lays destruction, a path of destruction. Eventually takes Atlanta. The citizens of Atlanta flee, and the panic, they actually start Atlanta on fire themselves and burn most of Atlanta down to the ground. Sherman takes the city and then continues his march to the coastline, to the Atlantic coastline at Savannah. And so from the fall into the winter months, he again lays a path of destruction, 60-mile wide, houses were robbed. Although Sherman does not sanction this, it's not legal. Soldiers would be punished if they did this, but still soldiers are given permission to confiscate property, confiscate food. Fields are burned. Roads are littered with livestock that was killed by the Union Army and kept for their own food, and things that they did not need they destroyed so the Confederates couldn't use that food as well. It's basically laying waste to everything. And by December of 1864, Sherman marches into Savannah and sends a telegram to President Lincoln where he says, "Congratulations, Mr. President, Merry Christmas. I present to you Savannah, Georgia." And so Georgia is completely laid to waste. And then the following spring, in March 1865, Sherman continues his march through South Carolina into North Carolina, again laying waste to everything that is in his path. So when we think about this part of the Civil War, it is coming now to a very, very clinical part where it seems as if the North is now finally making inroads. The North is finally getting victories. The South is having a harder time withstanding these assaults in their own territory. The Sherman is just laying waste throughout the Deep South, and Grant in Virginia is taking body blows after body blows to Lee, greatly weakening the Confederate Army. The Anaconda Plan is starting to suffocate the South. It seems as if the war is just about to the conclusion, but it's not quite done yet. So that is total warfare. That is General Grant's philosophy to end the Civil War. Thank you for listening, and as always, if you have questions, please make sure you ask your teacher.